I'm thrilled to now start. But to conclude our 6th annual review with our session 13 panel on statutes, regs, executive orders, and policies. Our distinguished panel members are Mike Scheingold, who is the chair of the Greenberg Trauig's Government Contracts and Projects Practice, Cara Sacalotto, who is a partner in the Government Contracts Practice at Wiley, and David Black, who is co-chair of Holland and Knight's National Government Contracts Group. Mike, there's been a lot of law passed this last year. You want to kick us off?
I do, Alan. Thank you for the kind introduction. And by the way, congratulations on joining PubK Group.
Thank you.
And I'm glad to see that you can hear me too. So as you can see from slide 2, I'm going to try to discuss 7 acts of Congress with an emphasis on the most recent New Year's Day National Defense Authorization Act, which truly is an act of Congress because it overrode a presidential veto. Since I have a lot of material to cover, I'll be moving pretty quickly and no doubt be even more boring than in previous years. Fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for all of you, the material that I'm going to cover is in my slides and in the written summary. I will not have time, you'll be happy to know, to go over all the slides. So we'll start with the Payment Integrity Information Act of 2019, which is slide 3. On March 2nd, 2020, the president signed this act into law. The act's purpose is to improve, well, it's got a couple purposes, but its primary purpose is to improve efforts to identify and reduce government-wide improper payments, which annually total around a very large figure of $175 billion. They hope to improve these efforts by codifying, updating, and improving previous improper payment laws. According to the statute, an improper payment is, quote, any payment that should not have been made or that was made in an incorrect amount, including an overpayment. That's not very helpful. We would all know that. Under a statutory, contractual, administrative, or other legally applicable requirement. Turning to slide 4, since 2002, Congress has passed piecemeal bills to deal with improper payment issues, including the Improper Payments Information Act of 2002, the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act of 2010, a similarly named one in 2012, and others. While these acts incrementally improved relevant statutory authorities, they aren't well coordinated. Congress recognized that the statutory requirements concerning federal improper payments are scattered throughout the U.S. Code, and the statutes in total lacked coherence and left certain aspects up to agency interpretation. So to improve this situation and to improve the coherence of improper payments laws, and also to improve agency compliance, the Act repeals the previous improper payments laws and combines the language of each into a new subchapter 4 of Chapter 33 in U.S. Code Title 31. The Act also, quote, omits areas of duplication and allegedly improves and updates areas that warrant attention. Turning to slide 5, please. We will now talk about the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, which the president signed into law on March 27, 2020. Because this act has been discussed and dissected in detail by many very knowledgeable practitioners, I'll try to summarize it briefly, but as you know from the materials in my previous presentations, brevity is not one of my strong points. I will skip PPP loans. So most importantly, Section 3610 of the CARES Act provides federal agencies the authority to modify contracts without consideration, to reimburse contractors under limited circumstances for paid or sick leave a contractor provides employees or subcontractors to maintain a ready state, including to protect the life and safety of government and contractor personnel. Slide 6, please. This authority is subject to several notable statutory limitations. First, reimbursement by the government is discretionary, not mandatory. Two, the applicable contracts must be modified to provide for the reimbursement. Three, reimbursement is limited to the minimum contract billing rates and cannot exceed an average of 40 hours per week. Four, the reimbursed expense must be used to retain employees or subs in a ready state. Five, reimbursable expenses are limited to those incurred between March 27, 2020 and March 31, 2021. On to slide 7, please. 6, reimbursable expenses are limited to those employees or subs that cannot perform work on a federally approved site due to facility closures or other restrictions, which isn't defined, and who cannot telework because of their job duties. And 7, the contractor must offset reimbursements under this section by the amount of any credits under other parts of the CARE Act or under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Since this authority is discretionary, satisfaction of Section 3610's criteria does not guarantee that a contracting officer will use this authority and provide the permitted reimbursement. Reimbursement is also subject to availability of appropriations. Slide 8, please. Interestingly, as of September 30, 2020, DoD reimbursed contractors a rather modest $68.3 million in leave costs. DoD has identified at least an additional 157 contracts for which contracting officers plan to use this authority to reimburse a minimum of an additional $49.9 million. Now, the DoD IG has identified that Section 3610 authority was not more widely used within DoD because contracting officers were flexible and creative. The defense industrial base was declared a critical infrastructure. There was no appropriation of funds specifically for Section 3610, and contractors used other forms of COVID-19 assistance. Not surprisingly, various other agencies have issued their own guidance on Section 3610. Now, slide 9, please. The remainder of the government contracts provisions of the CARES Act relate to the use of the Defense Production Act, other transaction authority, undefinitized contract actions, and the Strategic National Stockpile to facilitate pandemic responsive contracting. And slide 10, please. So, next, on August 8, 2020, the President signed into law the Department of Veterans Affairs Contracting Preference Consistency Act. We'll call it the Consistency Act, which clarifies the relationship between the Ability One program and the Department of Veterans Affairs Veterans First program. Slide 11, please. Congress passed this legislation in response to the Federal Circuit's 2018 ruling in PDS Consultants v. United States. In that case, the circuit held that where a product or service is on the Ability One procurement list and ordinarily would result in the contract being awarded to a nonprofit qualified to assist blind and severely handicapped workers, the 2006 Veterans Benefits, Healthcare, and IT Act unambiguously demands that priority be given to veteran-owned small businesses. So Congress was very concerned that this would lead to the destruction of employment and employment opportunities for individuals who are blind or severely disabled. Slide 12, please. As a result, the Consistency Act amends that 2006 Veterans Benefits, Healthcare, and IT Act, which had established the Rule of Two requirement. Under the Rule of Two, a VA contracting officer must restrict competition to veteran-owned small businesses, VOSBs, or service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, SDVOSBs, if She has a reasonable expectation that 2 or more small veteran-owned businesses will submit offers, and that the award can be made at a fair and reasonable price that offers best value. The Consistency Act amends 38 U.S.C. 8127 by providing that the rule of two analysis generally is not mandated for those requirements added to the Ability One procurement list, that is to be performed by the blind and severely disabled workers. So moving on to slide 13. On October 30, 2020, President Trump signed into law the Protecting Business Opportunities for Veterans Act of 2019. This act amends 38 U.S.C. Section 8127, which we just discussed, to add a new subsection, limitations on subcontracting. Before awarding a contract under Section 8127, which allows VA contracting officers to restrict competition under certain conditions to SDVOSBs and VOSBs, the VA is now required to obtain a certification from the offeror that it will comply with subcontracting limitations if awarded the contract. So what's going on here? Well, the VA has identified as a major issue pass-through schemes, and in particular schemes where companies that are SDVOSBs or VOSBs, or allege that they are, obtain contracts reserved for those entities, but perform little, if any, of the work and subcontract it to someone else, usually big company, big co. The legislation is intended to help the VA identify instances where VOSBs and SDVOSBs improperly pass through work on prime contracts to other entities. Next, we will turn to slide 15, please. On December 4th, 2020, President Trump signed the Internet of Things, or IoT, Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 into law. I'm here to tell you now that the takeaway is that the internet is a passing fad. Okay, more seriously, the takeaway is that this act does impact government contractors and federal procuring agencies. Not later than 90 days after the act's enactment, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, must develop and publish standards and guidelines for the government on the appropriate use and management of IoT devices owned or controlled, used by the government with respect to cybersecurity risks. Within 180 days of the publishing of those standards, OMB, in consultation with Homeland Security, must review agencies' existing information security policies and ensure that they are consistent with NIST standards. The FAR must be revised to implement these standards. Turning, please, to slide 16. NIST must develop and publish guidelines for a contractor or subcontractor providing to an agency an information system, including an IoT device, on 1, receiving information about a potential security vulnerability, and 2, disseminating information about the resolution of the security vulnerability. Now, within 2 years of this act's enactment, OMB, in consultation with DHS, must develop and oversee the implementation of policy standards or guidelines as may be necessary to address security vulnerabilities with respect to IoT devices. The FAR must be amended accordingly. Slide 17, please. Finally, the Act prohibits agencies from procuring or obtaining, renewing a contract to procure or obtain, or using an IoT device if the agency's chief information officer determines that the use of such device prevents compliance with security standards on IoT device use. This prohibition becomes effective on December 4th of 2022. Next, we'll move to slide 18. On December 27, 2020, the President signed the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2021 into law. Section 330 permits any 8A certified business that was in the 8A program, quote, on or before September 9th, 2020, to extend its participation in the program by an additional year, that is up to 10 years. This extension, of course, responds to the difficulties experienced by many small businesses due to COVID-19. But if you read the statute literally, it appears to apply to any 8A business that was in the 8A program at any time before September 9th, 2020. That's probably why Judge Learned Hand said the best way to misconstrue a statute is to read it literally and without consideration of its context. Now, the SBA administrator was required to issue regulations under this statute within 15 days and without regard to the Administrative Procedure Act's rulemaking requirements, which means that the deadline was January 11th, 2021. Given the pandemic and holiday season, the SBA did an excellent job in issuing the regulations on January 13th. And they did cure that plain language problem I just mentioned. Finally, a substantively identical provision to this section is included as Section 869 of the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. Okay, I lied to you at the beginning. We will briefly discuss an eighth statute. On New Year's Eve, President Trump signed the Secure Federal Leases from Espionage and Suspicious Entanglements Act into law. Its purpose is to provide ownership information to federal tenants leasing high security space that would allow the tenants to mitigate potential national security risks. There were some very substantial weaknesses in federal programs with respect to leasing high security space from certain foreign nationals. So before entering into a lease agreement that will be used for such high security space, a federal lessee shall require the identification and disclosure of whether the immediate or highest level owner of the leased space is a foreign person or a foreign entity. This act is applicable to GSA, the Architect of the Capitol, and any other federal agency other than DOD, that is Independent Statutory Leasing Authority. The act is also inapplicable to the intelligence community. The FY 2018 National Defense Authorization Act provided DOD similar authority with respect to such high security lease space. Slide 20, please. On New Year's Day, 2021, 3 months after the October 1 start of fiscal year 2021, the William M. Mack Thornberry National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, for FY 2021 became law after Congress overrode a presidential veto. While this is the 60th fiscal year in a row that Congress has enacted an NDAA, it was delayed by congressional disputes over its proposed contents and, of course, by the December 23rd veto by the president. Slide 21, please. Unfortunately, it has become common practice for the NDAA to be enacted well after the start of its fiscal year. The FY 2019 NDAA is the only NDAA since 1997 to become law before the start of the fiscal year, a testament in large part to Senator McCain, for whom the law was named. The FY 2021 NDAA's procurement-related reforms and changes are primarily located, as usual, in the Act's Title VIII, Acquisition Policy, Acquisition Management, and Related Matters, which includes 63 provisions addressing procurement matters. I'm going to read all 63 provisions to you, so we'll be here till tomorrow. Now, more seriously, the 63 provisions is modestly less than the last 4 NDAAs, which respectively contained 78, 71, 73, and 88 Title 8 provisions. Now, the importance of an NDAA and its impact on federal procurement law should not be measured simply on the total number of procurement provisions, but nevertheless, the 2021 NDAA includes more Title 8 procurement provisions than some other recent NDAAs, including FY 2015, 2014, and 2013, which had 37, 13, and 49 provisions, respectively. Certain provisions in other titles of the FY 2021 NDAA are very important to procurement law, and some of them could have been included in Title 8 and have been in the past NDAAs. Significantly, some of the 2021 NDAA provisions will not become effective until the FAR, DFARs, or other regulations are amended or promulgated, and sometimes this can take 2 to 4 years. Slide 22, please. Section 806 replaces the term significant deficiency with respect to a contractor business system with the term material weakness. A significant deficiency is a shortcoming in the system that materially affects the ability of officials of DoD and a contractor to rely upon information produced by the system that is needed for management purposes. Section 806 provides that material weakness means, quote, a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in the internal control over information in contractor business systems, such that there is a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement of such information will not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. The 2021 NDAA's joint explanatory statement indicates that the purpose of this change is to eliminate confusion about the seriousness of deficiencies in DoD contractor business systems and provide for a more nuanced approach to classifying such deficiencies by aligning the standards used to evaluate contractor business systems with generally accepted auditing standards. Now, that frankly is a polite way of saying that DoD's definition of significant deficiency was widely viewed as inconsistent with generally accepted auditing standards. So turning to slide 23, please. Section 814 modifies the Truthful Cost or Pricing Data Statute, formerly known as the Truth in Negotiations Act, or TINA, and still commonly known as that. TINA generally applies to contracts without adequate price competition that are not commercial products or services. Under Section 814 and subject to those qualifications, this provision establishes a standard $2 million threshold for application of the requirements of TINA with respect to subcontracts, modifications, and price adjustments. Prior to this section's passage, for prime contracts entered into on or before June 30, 2018, price adjustments, modifications, and subcontracts had been subject to a $750,000 TINA threshold. There was a May 31, 2018 DoD class deviation that allowed some contractors to get up to the $2 million threshold. In any event, the takeaway here is that the TINA threshold is now generally $2 million. Slide 24, please. Section 815 amends Title 10 to strengthen the requirement that DoD establish a goal to pay small business contractors and small business first-tier subs within 15 days of receipt of a proper invoice. Now, this will all depend with respect to its effectiveness as to how it is implemented in the DFARS. So we will have to wait to see. And we may have to wait 2 to 4 years, but hopefully not. Slide 25, please. In making a determination whether a particular product or service meets the definition of a commercial product or commercial service, Section 816 amends Title 10 to provide that a DoD contracting officer may, 1, request support from DCMA, DCAA, or other appropriate DoD experts to make a determination whether a product or service is a commercial product or commercial service, and 2, consider the views of appropriate public and private sector entities. In addition, within 30 days of contract award, DoD contracting officers shall or are now required to submit a written memorandum summarizing the commercial product or service determination, including a detailed justification for that determination. Okay, moving on to slide 27, please. Section 819 builds upon FY 2020 NDAA Section 847, which directed DoD to improve its processes and procedures for the assessment and mitigation of risks related to foreign ownership, control, or influence, that is FOCI, of DoD contractors and subcontractors. With respect to this section, the joint explanatory statement directs DoD to establish contract administration procedures for appropriately responding to changes in contractor or subcontractor beneficial status. More specifically, the process or procedures here for the assessment and mitigation of risk relating to FOCI is amended to add a requirement for DoD to conduct periodic reports and examinations so that, for example, you aren't cleared on day one and your status changes. Covered contractors and subs are companies that have a contract or are bidding for a DoD contract valued at $5 million or more, or actually in excess of $5 million. Apparently upset at the slow pace of work on Section 847, the joint explanatory statement requires that not later than March 1, 2021, DoD provide to the Congressional Defense Committees a detailed plan and schedule for the implementation of Section 847. Finally, not later than July 1, 2021, DoD shall revise relevant directives, guidance, training, and policies, including the DFARS, to fully implement the requirements of 2020 NDAA Section 847. Currently, the FAR and DFARS do not specifically reference FOCI or foreign ownership, control, or influence. Slide 28. Within 90 days of the passage of this act, Section 833 requires the Secretary of Defense to publish and maintain on betasam.gov a list of consortia used by DoD to announce other transaction opportunities or otherwise make such opportunities available. Apparently, it has not been easy to locate these opportunities on your own. GAO is also required to conduct a study on this. Moving slide 29, please. Section 837 requires Secretary of Defense to 1, identify policies and procedures protecting defense-sensitive U.S. intellectual property, technology, and other data and information from acquisition by the government of China, and 2, develop additional policies and procedures if necessary to better protect these assets. In developing the policies, the Secretary must 1, establish and maintain a list of critical national security technology that may require restrictions on current or former DoD employees, contractors, or subcontractors that contribute to such technology. 2, review the existing authorities under which DoD employees may be subject to post-employment restrictions with foreign governments and with organizations such as FOCI. And 3, identify additional measures that may be necessary to enhance the existing authorities. Slide 30, please. This section further requires the Secretary of Defense to consider mechanisms to restrict current or former employees of DoD contractors or subs that contribute significantly and materially to a critical national security technology, from working directly for a company wholly owned by the government of China or for companies that have been determined to be under Chinese foci. Turning to slide 31. Section 846 requires the Secretary of Defense to assess the R&D, manufacturing and production capabilities of the national technology and industrial base and of other allies and partner countries. The national technology and industrial base includes persons and organizations that are engaged in R&D, production integration services, or IT activities conducted within the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada. So that's giving us a sort of list of our closest allies. This section also requires the Secretary of Defense to establish a process for considering whether to include additional member countries in the national technology and industrial base, that is, to expand it beyond the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. Slide 32, please. Under Section 848, the Secretary of Defense must, to the maximum extent practicable, acquire strategic and critical materials required to meet defense, industrial, and essential needs from sources in the following order. 1, sources located within the US, not a surprise. 2, sources located within the national technology and industrial base, that is the US, of course, but the UK, Canada, and Australia. And 3, other sources as appropriate. Now, moving on to Section 849, it requires the Secretary of Defense to perform analyses of certain items to determine and develop appropriate actions with respect to sourcing or investment to increase domestic industrial capacity and explore ways to encourage critical technology industries to move production to the US. According to the joint explanatory statement, the impetus for this provision is continuing concern about, quote, over-reliance on non-domestic sources of supply for certain technologies and products that are critical to national defense, and, quote, the significant supply chain vulnerability that has further been demonstrated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Actions that DoD may take based on the results of its analysis include: 1, restricting procurement to US suppliers, national technology and industrial base suppliers, suppliers in other allied nations or other suppliers, and 2, prohibiting procurement from selected sources or nations. Slide 33, please. Section 862 transfers the responsibility for verifying veteran-owned and service-disabled veteran-owned small business status from the VA to the SBA. VA, of course, retains responsibility for verifying an individual's status as a veteran or service-disabled veteran. And SBA will also take over responsibility for maintaining a database of eligible SDVOBs and VOSBs. Turning to slide 34, please. And sorry for the sprint here, but I'm starting to run out of time. On December 17, 2018, President signed into law the Small Business Runway Extension Act of 2018, which changed the formula for determining whether a firm meets revenue-based small business size standards by lengthening the period for calculating average annual receipts from 3 to 5 years. That act did not impact size standards for manufacturing contracts, which are based on employee count. Section 863 now extends the period of measurement for employee-based size standards for manufacturers from 12 to 24 months. This is supposed to help businesses continue to qualify as small despite temporary increases in employee number. It could, however, also cause a business that would have qualified as small if the number of employees were measured over a 12-month period to be ineligible if the business had a very high average number of employees in the first 12 months of the 2 years used for measurement. In other words, if a business has shrunk over the previous 24 months, which, by the way, does not seem to be an unreasonable development given COVID-19, this provision could hurt that business by preventing it from qualifying as small. Slide 35, please. Section 868 amends the Small Business Act to allow small businesses bidding on prime contracts that have previously participated in a joint venture but have no relevant past performance information of their own to use the joint venture's past performance for evaluation purposes. They, of course, have to identify the work that they've done. And notably, the section allows small businesses to use the past performance of the joint venture without regard to whether the other JV member or members were small businesses. This section also amends the Small Business Act to provide that prime contractors that have performed contracts that require small business subcontracting plans to provide first-tier small business subs with a past performance record of their performance upon request from the first-tier sub. Now, turning to slide 37, please. Pursuant to Section 883, DoD may not award a contract for the procurement of goods or services to a contractor unless the contractor represents that it does not require its employees to sign internal confidentiality agreements or statements that would prohibit or otherwise restrict such employees from lawfully reporting fraud, waste, or abuse related to the performance of a DoD contract, and two, it will inform the employees of this limitation. The CO can rely on the representation of a contractor on this point unless the contracting officer has reason to question the accuracy of the representation. You should note that certain FAR clauses already exist to address some of these issues, including FAR 52203-18 and 19 regarding prohibition on requiring certain internal confidentiality agreements or statements. Next, slide 38. Continuing a bit of a theme, Section 885 amends Title 41 to require identification and disclosure in the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System, that is FAPIS, in that database of the beneficial owners of a corporation that is bidding on or awarded a federal contract or grant. The term corporation is very broadly defined. Slide 39, please. You will recall that in a controversial and also ambiguous provision, Section 827 of the 2018 NDAA required the Secretary to establish a pilot program to determine the effectiveness of requiring contractors to reimburse DoD for protests that they lost, whether there was a GAO decision denying it, and where the company had revenues in excess of $250 million. This pilot program was scrapped. However, in its place, the joint explanatory statement directs the Secretary of Defense to undertake a study to examine elements of the 2017 NDAA Section 885 for which the RAND Corporation was unable to obtain full and complete protest data during its analysis. There is a lot of interesting information that this study has to research, including the rate at which protesters are awarded the contract that was the subject of the bid protest, a description of the time it takes DoD to implement corrective action after a ruling or a decision, etc. This data will be very interesting and I think useful to the procurement community. Also required is a study of agency-level bid protests that builds upon Professor Chris Eukin's recent study submitted to the Administrative Conference of the United States. I will go through a couple of other items quickly. Section 890 requires DoD to identify on Federal Procurement Data System any contracts for border walls, construction or modifications with affecting the Mexican border of $7 million or more. Section 901 repeals the short-lived office of the Chief Management Officer of DoD. Title 17 deals with cyberspace-related matters and has 52 provisions that do impact government contracts in certain situations and help to fund small manufacturers in complying with cybersecurity matters. And finally, I do think it's important to note that Title 18, and this is slide 44, transfers, reorganizes, redesignates, renumbers, and consolidates defense acquisition statutes into Part 5 of Subtitle A of Title 10 of the U.S. Code. Title 18 is supposed to create a more rational organization of the acquisition statutes, loosely following the FAR's structure. The reorganization is not intended to result in policy changes or to change the meaning of the impacted statutes, but there are a lot of details that still have to be worked out, and it is unclear exactly where this is going. I think it will be constructive. Slide 45 advises that specific recommendations for modifications to the legislative text of Title 18 may be discussed with DoD. And finally, there is an effective date of January 1, 2022. So that completes my sprint, for which I apologize, through the 2020 statutory developments. I hope that some of you are still awake to hear what Cara and David have to say on more important subjects.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. I'm Cara Sacalato, and I'm a partner at Wiley in the Government Contracts Group. I'm going to be continuing our sprint, but now we're changing our running shoes and we're going to be sprinting through the procurement-related regulations that were passed in 2020. As Mike hinted, when there is an NDAA, they're usually implemented in the FAR or the DFARs, and that process can take several years. Sometimes it's quite quick, other times it takes years and years. So you'll hear me making reference to proposed rules and final rules that are implementing provisions of the NDAA from several years past. My slides are organized by a topic, and some of the topics have been covered by other panels. So I will not be covering those in excruciating detail, since you also heard from them from prior panels, in particular small business and cybersecurity. And generally, I've grouped them from oldest to newest. The first topic we're going to cover is small business related regulations, and there's quite a few of these. The first bullet relates to a proposed FAR rule to implement Section 863 of the FY16 NDAA, which required contracting entities to provide public notices of determinations of substantial bundling or consolidation of contract requirements. Now, such a notice is important for small businesses because a consolidation or bundling of requirements might deprive a small business of being able to perform work that it previously could perform when that work was unbundled into its various components. On the other hand, notice of such a consolidation of requirements could also benefit small businesses by alerting them to subcontracting opportunities. The notice must be publicly posted, and a solicitation should not be issued until 7 days after notice, again, so that small businesses have awareness of this bundling. The agency must also provide a justification for the consolidation or bundling determination. The second bullet is a proposed FAR rule to implement Section 1821 of the fiscal year 2017 NDAA and associated SBA regulations regarding good faith efforts to comply with small business subcontracting plans. The proposed FAR clause 19-705-7 provides indicators of what is a good faith effort to comply with the plan, as well as examples of what might not be good faith effort to comply with such a plan. Among other things, examples of a good faith effort include conducting market research to identify small business subcontractors and participating in mentor protege programs. Examples of a lack of good faith include, among other things, failure to designate a company official to administer the plan, failure to pay small business subcontractors on a timely basis, and failure to correct negative findings from subcontracting reviews. The proposed FAR changes are intended to align with SBA rules, which is a theme you'll see throughout here, is trying to align the FAR with SBA rules, which is a perennial problem. The third bullet relates to a proposed FAR rule to align the FAR with a final SBA rule on joint ventures between large contractors and small businesses. There are a number of changes in this rule, and I will highlight just a few of them. Among other things, the proposed rule identifies when a JV can be considered a particular type of small business based on the status of the members of the JV or the small business member of the JV. It would require contracting officers, consistent with a part of the NDAA that Mike mentioned, to consider the past performance of the JV and each member of the JV if the JV itself does not have its own history of past performance. In response to a GAO protest, another proposed change is to clarify that the JV agreement need only be approved by contract award and not proposal submission. The proposed rule is also intended to clarify provisions of the FAR to provide that JVs do not need to be certified by the SBA for participation in a procurement. Let's go to slide 48, please. Okay, the first slide bullet here addresses the Department of Defense final rule that amends the DFARS to implement Section 852 of the fiscal year 19 NDAA regarding accelerated payments to small business contractors and subcontractors. The final rule expresses a goal, not a mandate, of paying small businesses within 15 days of when the prime contractor receives payment from the government. And it has a goal rather than a mandate because the NDAA itself expresses a goal. DoD retained the timing to run from when the prime receives payment instead of when the prime receives an invoice from the small business, because some primes themselves are small businesses and would need to receive payment first. But Section 873 of the fiscal year 2020 NDAA changed the rules a little bit and said that addressed accelerated payments and expresses a goal of payment within 15 days of receipt of a proper invoice. So interestingly, there is an open FAR case to prepare a proposed rule to implement the newer NDAA requirement, but there is no open DFARS case regarding it. So it's possible that this FAR case will supersede this DFARS rule. The second bullet is pretty self-explanatory. DoD issued a final rule that amends the DFARS to implement a provision of the fiscal year 2020 NDAA that increased the threshold for requiring a justification and approval to award a sole source contract to a participant in the Small Business Administration's 8A program to actions exceeding $100 million. So that makes it easier for DoD to award such, to make such awards. Slide 49, please. Okay, Mike did not cover the Paycheck Protection Program. I will touch upon it briefly. There is a veritable slew of regulations regarding the PPP program, which is the Paycheck Protection Program that was established as part of the CARE Act. Some of these came out by SBA and other ones were issued by the Treasury Department. In April, the SBA posted its first interim final rule to implement the PPP with an effective date of the date of issuance of that interim rule so that the PPP could be implemented immediately. Over subsequent months, the SBA issued guidance for the PPP through multiple interim rules. For example, SBA provided guidance on the loan forgiveness application and rules for consideration of affiliation for purposes of the PPP. On June 5th, however, Congress passed the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act, which eased several of the requirements for the Paycheck Protection Program. Shortly thereafter, SBA issued regulations to implement that statute, to clarify an aspect of the rule regarding eligibility for loan forgiveness, and to note required changes to the PPP loan application and forgiveness application as a result of the recent statute. In another notable development, in late October 2020, SBA issued an information collection that included, among other things, a PPP loan necessity questionnaire, which has been challenged in federal court regarding a borrower's, quote, good faith certification that economic uncertainty made the borrower's loan request necessary to support its ongoing operations, close quote with some brackets. The lawsuit alleges that this questionnaire conflicts with prior SBA guidance. So you can see what happens when the train is moving so very, very fast here. The second bullet relates to a final SBA rule that is an omnibus cleanup of numerous prior SBA rules in response to Executive Order 13777 from the prior administration, which, as David will discuss, has now in fact been revoked. In response to that executive order, which was essentially have less regulations, SBA reviewed its rules and removed those rules that were redundant and some that were no longer operative because of changes in the law regarding the small disadvantaged business program. Let's go to slide 50, please. The first bullet on this slide relates to an SBA final rule consolidating the 8A mentor protege program with the all small mentor protege program. And I know that this was also discussed in the small business program. Briefly, the rule eliminated the 8A version of this program, including the unique requirements for that program, so that mentor and protege arrangements for that program are treated the same as any other mentor-protege arrangement. It also formalized SBA's practice of allowing a mentor-protege relationship to be canceled within the first 18 months to not count towards the firm's 2 mentor lifetime limit, provided the protege doesn't abuse that privilege. SBA also clarified the rules to qualify as a protege when the concern is small under its secondary North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS code, but other than small under its primary NAICS code. Now, although this rule purports to be about consolidating rules about mentor-protege arrangement, buried within it are a host of other additional changes to SBA rules. One of them eliminates the so-called 3 and 2 rule for all joint ventures that limited the joint venture to receiving 3 contracts in 2 years, and instead sets a blanket rule providing that all joint ventures that have a 2-year limit starting from the date of the first contract award. There are also several changes to the rules related to application to multiple award contracts, and important changes related to recertification and eligibility for contract extensions and set-asides when there's a recertification that renders the small business other than small, for example, as a result of a novation or a sale or whatnot. So definitely worth reading, even if you are not in the mentor-protege program. The second bullet relates to an SBA final rule to implement a statutory requirement that to certify women-owned small business concerns and economically disadvantaged women-owned small business concerns participating in the women-owned small business contract program. Before these rules, these small businesses self-certified their status. Now, in lieu of self-certification, there is SBA certification. SBA will accept certification from certain identified government entities or certification by certain SBA approved third parties. After the effective date of this rule, which was in mid-July 2020, women-owned small businesses and economically disadvantaged women-owned small businesses that are not certified in this manner cannot participate in the women-owned small business contract program. However, women-owned small businesses that do not participate in the program can continue to self-certify their status and receive contract awards outside that particular program. Let's go to slide 51. This one is short and sweet. The GSA issued a class deviation in April that is similar to the DoD rule that I discussed promoting accelerated to small businesses. However, the GSA class deviation tracks section 873 of the fiscal year 2020 NDAA that I mentioned, that expresses a goal of payment within 15 days of receipt of a proper invoice from the small business. As opposed to the final DoD rule, which triggers payment, the goal to run from payment from the government. So thus for covered GSA contracts, GSA is moving out on accelerated small business payments ahead of the pending FAR rule that I mentioned. Let's go to the next slide, 52. Okay, we are leaving small businesses and making a 360 turn almost to foreign supplies and companies. And I want to spend a little bit of time, but certainly not as much time as this interim rule deserves, talking about, or these two interim rules deserve, that implement section 889 of the fiscal year 19 NDAA. In a nutshell, section 889 covers certain telecom equipment and services produced and provided by these telecommunications company, and also video surveillance equipment by certain identified Chinese companies. The most notable company subject to the 889 restrictions is Huawei, a telecommunications company. And section 889A1B prohibits executive agencies from entering into contracts with an entity that uses any equipment, system, or service that uses covered telecommunications equipment as a substantial or essential component of the system, and you cannot use a system that uses covered equipment. So essentially, the idea is to preclude companies that do business with the government from using these prohibited Chinese telecom services, and also equipment that uses the prohibited Chinese telecom services. The interim rule is intended to implement these restrictions, and notably, it confirms that with respect to the Part B requirements, the restrictions are not limited to use of equipment in the provision of services to the government, and states in the interim rule that use is prohibited regardless of whether that usage is in performance of work under a federal contract. So it requires a pretty broad sweeping look into what the contractor uses, frankly, as all of its systems. The interim rule includes a representation in FAR 52204-24 that is made in the System for Award Management, or SAM, that requires the offeror to represent after reasonable inquiry whether they do or do not use covered telecommunications equipment or services, or equipment, systems, or services that use covered equipment, services, or systems. To assist in making that representation, the interim rule does provide some moderately helpful high-level guidance on what is a reasonable inquiry within a contractor's supply chain, and what is frankly not required. The interim rule also confirms that the compliance obligation applies to the entity that executes the contract at issue, the prime contractor or the offeror. As good as that might sound in limiting the obligations, I should note there's also an open FAR case that is considering whether to extend the rule and restrictions to affiliates, parents, and subsidiaries of the offeror, which will significantly expand the burden of checking for covered telecommunication systems. The FAR Council has received comments on that issue, but it has not yet issued a final rule on it. Originally, this representation that I'm talking about had to be made on an offer by offer basis, which was quite burdensome, especially for contractors who have a lot of proposals out there. The FAR Council issued a second interim rule to allow an offeror to represent in SAM in response to specific required representation that it does not use the covered telecommunications to make its representation annually instead of on an offer by offer basis. So in other words, an affirmative offer by offer response is really required if you are checking the do box or does box. Slide 53, please. Slide 53 relates to two final rules issued by the Bureau of Industry and Security within the Department of Commerce that ramps up the export restrictions on Huawei, its affiliates, and other prohibited parties. I'd like to refer you, there's a lot going on here, and it's best to refer you to the written materials for more detail on this. But generally, all of the changes were meant to further restrict Huawei and its affiliates from accessing certain materials that might be produced from US software and technology, to close perceived loopholes in the restrictions and restrict transactions with additional Huawei listed entities. Let's go to 54. Slide 54, please. Thank you. Slide 54, I added, because a new FAR rule came out that would have been very far reaching, but we added it before the Biden administration issued its first week of executive orders that David's going to talk about in just a few minutes. This final rule increased the percentage of domestic content that an end product must contain to be considered a domestic end product, imposed higher domestic content requirements for iron and steel, and increased the price evaluation preference for domestic end products. All of these rules were in furtherance of the Buy American Act. But this final rule had an effective date of January 21, which is critical. It was after inauguration date and would apply to solicitations issued in February. As a result of various executive orders David will discuss, including the Biden administration's own executive order Buy American policy, this rule, even though it furthers the Buy American Act, probably will not go into effect. So even though this rule expanded Buy American Act, and Biden's executive order is intended to expand coverage of the Buy American Act, this final rule stuck with the tried and true framework that currently applies to considering web domestic content and whether an end product is covered by the act. The Biden administration's executive order really proposes an entirely different framework. Also, the Biden administration's executive order supersedes the Trump administration's executive order to the extent it is inconsistent with the Biden executive order, and the Biden executive order on Buy American calls for its own FAR changes. So unlikely, much sure all of this will see its way. Next slide. Okay, we are now turning to cybersecurity and national security, and I will focus on the top bullet only. The second bullet, you can read it, and it is self-explanatory. I know that cybersecurity and this interim rule in particular were discussed by the cybersecurity panel in session 6 on Tuesday, but in case you missed that, I'll give you a high-level overview of what it does. So this interim rule is interesting because it implements two cybersecurity compliance requirements. The first is the National Institute for Standards and Technology that Mike referenced earlier, NIST, the NIST standard 800-171, and also the new forthcoming to be implemented Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, or CMMC. Under the NIST methodology, contractors are required to complete a self-assessment of their compliance with NIST 800-171 before they can receive DoD contracts. The interim rule defines 3 levels of assessment. To be eligible for award, a contractor must complete the basic level, the first level, which is a basic assessment. A basic assessment is performed against 110 controls in the NIST SP 800-171 standard. The other 2 levels, which are obviously medium and high, are assessments that DoD itself can conduct during the performance of the contract. Each assessment results in a summary level score, which represents the number of security requirements from the NIST standard that the contractor has implemented. Because the NIST standard includes 110 security requirements, the maximum score is, no surprise, 110. But the interim rule does not prescribe a specific number of minimum score to be eligible for award, although the contractor must identify a date by which it expects to achieve a score of 110 in order to complete the basic assessment. This NIST assessment is reflected in the DFARS clauses 252.204-7019 and -7020. Now, building on the NIST standard and going forward is the CMMC framework, which will be phased in over 5 years. And this adds a comprehensive certification framework to verify the implementation of both processes and practices that are associated with achieving a particular level of cybersecurity maturity. As discussed by the cybersecurity panel, the CMMC certification process is managed by a CMMC accreditation body. There are 5 levels of CMMC certification, with level 3 roughly aligned with the NIST standard. Certification of achievement of a particular level is not self-certified, but is made by third-party assessors. The CMMC will start with a limited rollout of contracts that are specifically approved for inclusion in CMMC by the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and then will be rolled out more broadly. The interim rules include a CMMC clause at 252.204-7021, which is remarkably brief and appears to reflect that the DoD and CMMC accreditation body will continue to be making policy and implementation guidance and whatnot through public papers. Both the NIST and the CMMC clause include flow down requirements that prime contractors will have to oversee and implement in their supply chain as appropriate, depending on the type of information that subcontractors receive. Going to the next slide. This is a grab bag of miscellaneous FAR rulemakings from the FAR Council. I'm going to cover the second and the third bullets briefly. And the second bullet is really just, I guess, indicative of the process we're going to be going through now that there's been a change in administration to the Biden administration. So this bullet relates to the FAR Council removing an entire subpart of the FAR that related to the non-displacement of qualified workers under service contracts. That subpart had been included in the FAR in response to an Obama administration executive order 13495. Now, the prior administration revoked that executive order in November 2019. So in response to that executive order revoking the Obama executive order, all of these rules got removed from the FAR. So this is an example of, for better or worse, how regulating via executive orders can lead to a lot of churn in the law. We think about it in certain churns and rights that apply to people, such as, the immigration and the funding of the border wall. but it falls down into the procurement space as well. And as David will illuminate when we talk about executive orders, we're going to see some aspect of that churn again, given the use of executive orders in the current administration. Again, for better or worse, it's just, I guess it's fact of life we have to get used to. The third bullet relates to a final FAR Council rule that amends the FAR to implement Section 825 of the fiscal year 2017 NDAA. This is actually kind of an interesting rule and provision of the NDAA that says that if you're going to have an IDIQ, a multiple award contract that's multiple award for same or similar services and intended to have every qualifying offeror eligible to participate in the IDIQ and orders, we're not going to evaluate, you don't have to, let's say, you don't have to evaluate cost or price at the IDIQ level. And if you choose not to evaluate cost or price at the contract level, at the high level IDIQ level, the contracting officer is to consider price or cost as a factor for each award of a task order under that IDIQ contract. And you can see how this might make a little bit more sense. It's difficult at the IDIQ contract to predict what the work's going to be. You'll often see, kind of sample tasks or whatnot. But if you have a task order, you have a specific set of requirements and can evaluate maybe with a bit more fidelity. And so this final FAR rule is implementing that provision of the NDAA. Let's go to the next slide, 57. The first bullet is simply a FYI for your information, nothing shocking or amazing there, but that the certified cost or pricing data and CAS coverage thresholds increased from 750K to 2 million for contracts awarded after July 1st, 2018. The second bullet relates to a proposed FAR rule, which actually has gotten a lot of comment, to change the definition of a commercial item in FAR 2.101 so that it conforms to Section 836 of the fiscal year 19 NDAA. Section 836 separated the definition of a commercial item into two distinct definitions, one for a commercial product and one for a commercial service. The separation of these definitions was one of the many, many, many recommendations from the Section 809 panel, which was convened a few years ago to address DoD procurement reform. That panel issued very lengthy reports with very many recommendations, and their mission ended in July of 2019 with, I would say, a relative handful of those recommendations making it into law today. This is one of them. Slide 58. So slide 58 is again just a couple of different miscellaneous DoD rulemakings. The first bullet, I don't want to get your hopes up about expedited contract closeouts too much. I would say read the rule. If you have smaller contracts, this may be a rule for you to get your contracts closed out, but it generally allows for closeouts in an expeditious basis if there's a very small amount of money, residual funds on the contract, and both parties say, I don't need that $87, just to make it easier to close out more contracts. The second bullet relates to a final DFARS rule to implement several sections from the fiscal year 2017 NDAA that address how contracting officers may require offerors to submit relevant information to support market research for price analysis. And it also allows an offeror to submit information relating to the value of a commercial item to aid in the determination of the reasonableness of the price of such an item. Let's go to 59. I told you it'd be fast. I'm only going to address the second bullet. This was a proposed DoD rule to amend the DFARS to implement Section 848 of the fiscal year 18 NDAA. This should kind of harkens back to some of the legislation that Mike talked about, the newer legislation, this being a bit older. But this provision of the 18 NDAA provides that a contract for a Part 12 commercial item serves as a prior commercial determination for a future contract unless the relevant official determines in writing that the prior determination was improper or that the item for some reason should not be acquired using FAR Part 12 procedures. The idea is to make it easier to rely on past determinations of commerciality and hopefully, fingers crossed, reduce inconsistent determinations of commerciality. The last area I'm going to talk about, well, second to the last, I should say, are some Department of Labor rulemakings that I thought were interesting. Certainly, there's been a lot. This first one is really driven to maximizing the ability of healthcare providers to participate in the TRICARE program. And what it does is it clarifies that the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs does not have jurisdiction to over healthcare providers whose sole government contract is based on the provider's participation in TRICARE, such that these healthcare providers don't have to comply with certain equal opportunity laws, equal employment opportunity laws, and the provisions of the Rehabilitation Act, and other types of programs if their only thing that they do is provide healthcare as a TRICARE provider. In the alternative, to not have saying we don't have jurisdiction over these guys, it establishes a national interest exception to the Executive Order 11246, Equal Employment Opportunity, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act. Again, so that these healthcare providers their only connection is providing healthcare to TRICARE recipients can participate. The second bullet relates to potentially a slightly more provocative OFCC final rule that created a religious exemption from anti-discrimination laws for certain federal contractors, this religious exemption would apply if the contractor holds itself out to the public as carrying out a religious purpose. We'll see what happens in the current administration with that. Don't know yet. It's only week one-ish, 7 days, 8 days in. Next slide. This is my final slide. I wanted to tell you about some things coming down the pike, but as we'll hear from David in a minute, everything coming down the pike is going to be slowed down substantially because of the change in administration. But it is, I pointed out two interesting FAR cases that relate to things that are not already, I haven't already discussed. The first one I really do hope goes through, which would be to align or combine the rules for suspension and debarment that are in the FAR and in the non-procurement common rule to make them more similar. Many of the the restrictions, if you're debarred by one, you're debarred by the other. They're reciprocal. So there's a push to have them kind of brought together more. And there are a lot of good ideas in the non-procurement rule that could be added to the FAR. So I hope that goes forward, but nothing's going to go forward quickly for reasons that David is now going to discuss. So thank you for your time. Hope you were able to keep up.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Next slide. I'm David Black, co-chair of the government contracts practice at Holland and Knight. And I'm happy to talk to you. We've covered statutes, regulations, and then moving down into the White House, we're going to cover executive orders. And then I've got a section on the Trump executive orders And then it's been a very active week for the Biden administration, and I've updated my slides from the draft here. So I'll give you a report on the Biden executive orders that touch on federal procurement, and then a couple of key policy updates as well. So without further ado, 2020 was an interesting year in executive orders because you saw a lot of activity in response to the pandemic, and especially the utilization, application, expansion of the Defense Production Act to respond to this crisis. So, and it's sort of interesting to follow the dates on these executive orders, as March and April were a time of rapid response to changing events. So things start off on March 18th with an executive order 13909 on prioritizing and allocating health and medical resources to respond to the spread of COVID-19. What this executive order did was basically clarify, confirm that HHS has what they call priorities and allocation authority over health and medical resources needed to respond to the spread of COVID-19. Now, they already had that authority regarding health resources, but I think the president wanted to just clarify health and medical resources, COVID-19, you all have it, go use it. And that allowed HHS to issue rated orders to replenish the national stockpile with N95 masks and that sort of thing. Then a couple days later, on March 23rd, we have EO 13910, which was addressed at preventing the hoarding of health and medical resources to respond to the spread of COVID-19. And the idea there, at that point in time, there was a concern that companies, contractors, businesses, opportunists were again buying up N95 masks, especially PPE, ventilators, and building up an inventory and then selling to the highest bidder. And that type of behavior, when the president does these sort of authorizations, violates the Defense Production Act. And so the president sort of delegated this authority again to HHS. You'll see the early actions were to HHS to prevent hoarding. And a week later, HHS issued in the Federal Register pursuant to this authority, so you kind of see this authority rolling out, a list of what they call scarce or threatened personal protective equipment and other medical resources. And again, identifying that list sort of authorizes, the enforcement of the Defense Production Act. And indeed, there were several prosecutions by DOJ of people who were hoarding these scarce and threatened PPE. Next slide. Now, again, this is still about 9 days after HHS received its sort of bulked up Defense Production Act authority. FEMA sort of raised its hand. Again, I'm uncertain of the dynamics of what led to this, but there was a push to give FEMA the same authority. And you kind of see this tug of war between two agencies, or another agency basically saying, hey, we're FEMA, we respond to emergencies, this is an emergency, there's a lot we could do to bolster the effort. So the president thought that was good policy, and with the Executive Order 13911, which was delegating additional authority under the DPA with respect to health and medical resources to respond to the spread of COVID-19, delegated several authorities to DHS. FEMA was really the primary intended recipient, but as DHS as the agency. So DHS received priorities and allocation authority over COVID-19 health and medical resources. DHS received authority to prevent hoarding of such resources. And then there was sort of a push to add additional DPA authorities, but then, again, co-equalize, co-delegate to Health and Human Services and Homeland Security Title III authority, which is to basically make investments, provide grants, funding, make investments to increase productive capacity and supply of COVID-19 health and medical resources. And in fact, there were several Title III investments made in production lines for personal protective equipment like N95 masks. In addition, both HHS and DHS receive authority to form voluntary agreements with industry. That authority, to my knowledge, has not been utilized yet. Next slide. So as we're rolling along into late March and April, the plot thickens. You see the more aggressive use of the Defense Production Act. On March 27th, there was a presidential memorandum that directed Health and Human Services to issue a priority rated order to General Motors Company, who was in addition to automobiles, was in the business of manufacturing ventilators, and that resulted in a rated order. And then a few days later, another presidential memorandum that directed FEMA, you see FEMA is getting into the act, to issue a priority rated order to 3M Company to produce N95 respirators. Then on April 7th, FEMA again is using its newly delegated authority. It issues an allocation order, not a priority order for producing or manufacturing or delivering health and medical resources. This is an allocation order to control the marketplace, and this was basically what FEMA's order said. It applied to a subset of the threatened or scarce or threatened health and medical resources, basically a list of certain PPE and other medical supplies, and it prevented their export outside the United States. So it shut the border to the export of these specific products without the prior approval of FEMA. And there was some coordination with Customs and Border Patrol. The rule and some subsequent guidance created some exemptions for certain situations, including manufacturers with continuous export agreements that met certain criteria. So they tried to find some reasonable exemptions. But this was a way to keep PPE and other medical supplies in the country. And just to point out that the Defense Production Act has a criminal penalty for violating its provisions. So there is criminal liability to exporters who may have violated this. Next slide. As we move on into April, the Department of Agriculture received a delegation of Defense Production Act authority with respect to food supply chain resources during the national emergency caused by COVID. And it, in a nutshell, delegated to the USDA authority to ensure that meat and poultry processors continue operations. If you remember, there was, some spreading of the virus at meat processing facilities, and USDA was granted authority to regulate that and prevent those facilities from shutting down entirely to protect the nation's food supply. Then in May 13, this is sort of an important and long-lasting result from this regulatory push from the executive order. A lot of folks know of the defense allocations and priority system, DPAS, just because in times of non-emergency, DOD is using its priorities authority. DLA has a lot of rated orders, but there's actually a broader regulatory system. There's now 6 sets of these regulations, and really the correct term is the federal priorities and allocation system, the FPAS, because Department of Commerce issues the DPAS, which covers DOD. Transportation has DPA authority over civil transportation. That's the TPAS. Health and Human Services has already had the DPA authority over health resources, the HR pass. So it's important to know, what is the subject of the priority and ratings authority, and then you have to, that's the agency that has it, and they have their set of FPAS regulations. So FEMA had to play catch up because they were the new kid on the block, and they were got the they basically implemented what they call the MPAS, the Emergency Management Priorities and allocation system. And the regulations are very similar to what you find in the DPAS. Next slide. Okay, so that was the response to the pandemic in executive orders. Thought it told an interesting story, so thought it was good, good to go through. And now we're going to change topics. And now you sort of see these are the remaining Trump administration executive orders. So first on August 3rd, you have an executive order 13940, which is aligning federal contracting and hiring practice with the interests of American workers. And this executive order basically required a review of contracts awarded in fiscal years 2018 and 2019 to assess how contractors are using temporary foreign labor to perform contracts, and contractors' performance of services in foreign countries that was previously performed by the U.S. offshoring. And then agencies are supposed to assess any negative impact they find from these practices and to propose corrective action. And again, that one was maybe setting up some future activity. The question will be whether those priorities align with the new administrations. The next slide. And then on August 6th, this is sort of a follow-on regarding the pandemic. Executive Order 13944, combating public health emergencies and strengthening national security by ensuring essential medicines, medical countermeasures, and critical impacts are made in the U.S. And this is one, and you'll see a similar topic covered by a Biden executive order that was issued in the past week. But this is encouraging federal agencies to basically restrict competition, and it talks in those terms of finding a way to limit competition to domestic sources, to max in the policies by excluding foreign-made essential medicines, medical countermeasures, and critical inputs. You will increase demand by the government, which would increase domestic production in the United States. And there's even a provision that requires the government to go seek any necessary changes to the government procurement agreement at the WTO, which the idea there is you try to get these types of supplies outside the Trade Agreements Act, which would again expand the application of the Buy American Act. Again, a lot of this is still in motion. That you do see some synergy between this particular procurement policy between the Trump and Biden administration. Then the Section 3 identifies vulnerabilities in the supply chains. So studying where those vulnerabilities might exist. You're going to see again some common ground with the Biden executive order. We'll touch on a little later. Section 4 wants to streamline environmental regulations for the development of advanced manufacturing facilities for these types of critical medicines, et cetera. And then Section 5 authorizes or asks HHS to basically make their contracts priority contracts under the Defense Production Act to prioritize the performance of federal contracts over non-federal contracts for those supplies and medicines. So again, the question is how much of this, all of these executive orders take time to result in regulations and, that affect procurement and contract clauses, how much, again, and there is overlap with what you'll see. But so clearly this is I think a policy you will see carried forward is increasing domestic production of medical supplies, medicines, countermeasures, those kinds of things. Next slide. Okay. Then Trump administration executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. This one has been revoked, so we won't spend a ton of time on it. It was a provision, and the clause, a far deviation clause, did make it into some contracts in November and December, but it's unlikely violations will be enforced because OFCCP is no longer enforcing this executive order. But the purpose was to basically regulate the diversity and inclusion training of federal contractors to prevent content that is within the umbrella of race and sex scapegoating and stereotyping. But again, there was a litigation. There was a nationwide preliminary injunction in December on First Amendment grounds. So it was short-lived even then, and then it was revoked on Inauguration Day in one of the first Biden executive orders. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and get into what we've seen in the past week. So Inauguration Day was a busy day with executive orders that touched on federal procurement or influenced federal procurement. Cara was alluding to this. Well, the second one on the second bullet on this page. The first one was to revoke a couple of early Trump executive orders about regulatory reform. There's a revocation of EO 13771 that was known as the 2-for-1 executive order. For every regulation issued by a federal agency, the federal agency had to identify 2 regulations and rescind those. So it was it was 1 for 2, I guess maybe is the way to put it. So that is no longer a requirement for federal agencies issuing regulation. This executive order 13777, there was also a requirement to make sure that the total cost impact of the new regulation was at least neutral. And this executive order provided some guidance on how to measure the cost of regulation. So this whole initiative of the early Trump administration is now off the books. Then there's a presidential action. This was not an executive order, it was framed as a presidential action to put in a regulatory freeze. And this deals with pending regulations, and including the one Cara was talking about on Buy America. It freezes all pending rules until they are reviewed and approved by an agency or department head appointed by President Biden. So again, it's not that these things will be scrubbed entirely. The Biden administration wants their people to review and approve, and so again, there'll be some on Buy America. There'll be some issues about whether they shelve that one simply because they're going to do something that they consider a little bigger than that. So there's, again, that applies to pending rules. Final rules not yet published in the Federal Register, and rules published that have not yet taken effect. And this is the provision that sinks the Buy American Act that took effect January 21st. And then any new pending or new proposed rules, likewise, are frozen until they are reviewed by an agency or department head appointed by President Biden. Next slide. So again, anything in the FAR and DFAR's pipeline is on hold. Again, a lot of the procurement stuff is probably neutral. A lot of it is implementing old NDAAs. So for the things like that, it shouldn't be a change in policy. It just sort of a double check and letting those things move forward at some point in the future. Then also on January 20th, there was an executive order protecting federal workers and requiring mask wearing. And this is a directive that agencies will immediately require compliance with CDC guidelines, with wearing masks, physical distancing, and other public health measures by on-duty or on-site federal employees and on-site federal contractors. So if you are performing a contract at a federal workplace, you can expect there'll at some point be a clause that definitely goes into new procurements. There's probably really a question about, once the clause exists, do they try to modify existing contracts for health and safety reasons? So we'll see how that plays out. Also on January 20th, there's a executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. And this is sort of an interesting one, given there is already a lot of federal contracting programs managed by SBA 8A program, Hub Zone, that share some of these purposes. But each agency is supposed to place sort of review and produce a plan identifying barriers and addressing barriers that underserved communities and individuals may face in taking advantage of agency procurement and contracting agency. And this was the executive order where sort of buried at the bottom is where they revoked the Trump executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. Next slide. Okay, now I have a couple of executive orders before we get to these policy developments. So in the past week, which was when we had to turn our slides in, on January 25th, there's an executive order ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. And this has gotten some press as the Buy American executive order. And the policy is, it's a common policy. But there is sort of going to be a revamp of FAR Part 25 and some other new angles on this. So the policy is to use federal grants and contracts to maximize U.S. produced goods and services. There's a real effort to reform the waiver authority, the waivers to Buy America. I think the concern is that they've been delegated too far down to people who maybe don't share an interest in Buy America, and they want the waiver authority to vest in senior agency leadership. They want to take that waiver authority from the rank and file contracting officers and lower level folks who might have it today. So agencies should vest that where they can. Agencies will consider suspending, revising, or rescinding any prior agency actions that are inconsistent with this Buy America policy. So they're supposed to review, identify any prior agency actions that are inconsistent with using federal contracts to maximize the U.S. production of goods and services, and suspend, rescind, or revoke those. So that will be underway, and we will see what comes of it. There's the creation of a new Made in America director within the Office of Management and Budget, who will be really closely managing and reviewing, establishing guidelines about the waiver process and having an opportunity to review and comment on any waivers that even with the higher level authority with the agencies. And so you see this Made in America director is in OMB, it's in the White House, it's closer to the president, and they're sort of taking the discretion away from the rank and file. There will be a public website at some point that has transparency and public notice of all proposed and granted waivers. There's going to be a review and a revision of FAR Part 25. This will probably take at least several months, and it has to go through the rulemaking. The executive order directs the replacement of the component test under the Buy American Act with a test that is based on the value added by the products, components, or the manufacturing process in the United States. So it's going to shift that to make sure what's happening in the United States adds more value. The details need to be filled in on that. There's going to be, this overlaps with the Trump executive order. There's going to be an increased threshold for domestic content requirements for end products and construction materials. They're directed to revise FAR Part 25 to increase the price preferences. Again, whether that'll be above or below what's in the frozen Trump executive order or Trump rule, I think it was, final rule, we will find out. But it'll be increased price preferences for domestic end products and construction materials. And then they want to update the list of non-available articles, because, of course, that's a big loophole in the Buy American Act under FAR 25.104A. So again, there'll be a review and revision and updating of that. They want to review the constraints on commercial IT. Again, there's for COTS IT, there's some flexibility to evade the Buy American Act, and they want to review that and perhaps shut the door on that. If you can kind of see where that might be heading. And then they also want increased reporting on agency enforcement activities regarding Made in America laws. And there's a report that's due within 180 days, and then there'll be periodic required reporting by agencies after that. Then there was revocation of some Trump executive orders. So there was a 2017 executive order 13788 regarding Buy American and Hire American that was revoked. Also revoked was Executive Order 13858 from January 31st, 2019 on strengthening Buy American preferences for infrastructure projects. Also revoked was an executive order of just 2 weeks ago, January 14th, 2021, Executive Order 13975 on encouraging Buy American policies for the U.S. Postal Service. So that was revoked. And there was a suspension of an executive order, interestingly, one from 1954, Executive Order 10582, prescribing uniform procedures for certain determinations made under the BAA. And so that was suspended, not revoked. And I think they probably want to look at that as part of the other reforms that are in motion, put in motion by this executive order. Next, nope, not next slide yet. Another Biden executive order, this one is on sustainable public health supply chain. This is the one that overlaps with the critical medicines executive order that we discussed a few minutes ago. This one is asked the Departments of State and Defense, Health and Human Services, and DHS to review the availability of critical materials, treatments, and supplies needed to combat COVID-19, and to take appropriate action under the Defense Production Act to fill any shortfalls by acquiring additional stockpiles, improving distribution systems, building market capacity, or expanding the industrial base. So that's a twofer. One is placing priority rated orders, and again, that's DHS and HHS have that authority with health and medical resources. And then the signals are maybe some real Title III investments, grants, in increasing production capacity. There will be the creation of a COVID response coordinator who will, there'll be some reporting from agencies, and the COVID-19 response coordinator will submit recommendations to the president about the additional possible use of the Defense Production Act. And then HHS will recommend changes to the anti-hoarding authorities of the Trump executive order we discussed earlier. Do there need to be any changes to HHS's anti-hoarding enforcement or authority? Again, this is just, make us recommendations. Nothing's happening just yet. Lastly, executive order on protecting and empowering federal workers and contractors. And this is one that there's no direction right now to increase the minimum wage. There's some direction to OMB to do some work that is expected to, within the first 100 days, to lead to a future executive order that would require federal contractors to pay a $15 minimum wage and provide emergency paid leave to workers. So this is a primer for a future executive order, and then that would take some time to end up in a FAR rule and a FAR clause, and it would apply to future procurements at some point. And then, just things to be on the lookout for. The Obama executive order that was revoked about non-displacement of qualified workers under service contracts. This is when you are regulating public procurement at the executive order level, you get this wild pendulum swing, and it would not surprise me if we saw the re-implementation of something like that. It's a curious thing to at least look out for. And then the Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces was obviously a controversial initiative of the Obama administration to see if there's some version of that to deal with contractor compliance with labor and employment rules. Maybe not as draconian as was being proposed back in 2015 and 2016, but we'll see if that is a policy initiative. And then I will take just a couple minutes to go over these policy initiatives. So for the For the DOJ has a procurement collusion strike force. In the past year, they've gotten organized. They've done several trainings, and there was a report they published saying they've done several trainings, especially at the state and local level, and they have dozens of grand jury investigations. They don't. The report did not say they have any convictions yet, but they have grand jury investigations pending. So that is picking up steam. For category management, this is a big initiative to basically for agencies in 10 categories of products and services to use, basically pushing them to agency-wide or government-wide IDIQ contract vehicles with the idea that those have the most leverage and result in saved money. GAO issued a report in November making 10 recommendations to bolster the initiative. And I think this continues to be a sweeping change because it's exempting more and more of procurement from protest scrutiny, because procurement under the IDIQ FAR Part 16 contracts has the $10 million and $25 million exemption from GAO jurisdiction. GSA has made progress on its consolidated schedule. The second phase of that rollout was completed at the end of July. 99% of federal supply schedule holders, GSA schedule holders with a single contract, have now been transitioned to the consolidated schedule, and they're working on the final phase where they're taking contractors that have multiple federal supply schedules and transitioning them down to a single contract. And then on the e-commerce front, in June, GSA made three awards of a pilot, an e-marketplace pilot program. The awardees are Amazon Business, Thermo Fisher Scientific, and Overstock.com. And there's a program to start purchasing under the micro purchase threshold, with certain agencies being invited to participate. And we'll see, that'll be an opportunity for lessons learned, that's going to be a major initiative in the COTS world. Many contractors took out PPP loans, Paycheck Protection Program loans, and they're now in the process of seeking forgiveness, basically converting those loans into grants. There is a DoD guidance that to the extent those forgiven loan amounts were used under cost reimbursement contracts to pay labor that was billed to the government, and even perhaps indirect costs that were billed to the government. The policy right now is the government wants to treat that as a credit under FAR Part 31.205-5, and they want to again, this would apply to cost reimbursement contracts only, but they want a credit for any forgiven amounts that were used for those costs. In the OTA world, in response to the pandemic, there was sort of a delegation of authority for OTAs for prototype projects in response to the pandemic. That's sort of, we're supposed to make that a little more flexible, a little more quick. And then we don't have time to get into this, but OMB issued really the first significant revision of the uniform guidance that applies to grants in August. And if you're in the grant world, you're probably aware of that, but if you're not, you definitely want to become familiar with it. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention today, and I'll turn it back over to Alan.
David, Cara, Mike, thank you very much.